So happy to be here. Thanks so much to the student government for organizing this. I don't remember these town halls when I was a student here, so it's fun to, I think this is cool, to like create a space for folks to really hash out what's going on campus and what it means to all of you and learn stuff together. And thanks to all the staff and faculty and everybody who made this happen as well. So yeah, I wanted to start by acknowledging that we're on Lenape territory. The land that we're on belongs to the Lenape people who were forcibly removed by the US government and now live in a number of places, including Ontario, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. And I wanted to start there for a number of reasons. One, because it's like just kind of good to think about. We're going to talk about Barnard and like what it is and why it is. It's good to think about like kind of really where it is and how it started, right? Like Barnard is part of Columbia University, right? And that project of founding this university on this land is a project of settling this land. It's a project of settler colonialism, right? We live in the United States, which is a settler colonial country, which means it's a country where the colonial project was one aimed at clearing the land of the people who lived here and engaging in an ethnic cleansing process and replacing those people with European settlers. And that built a country using slave labor to kind of create a space for white people and European people to be here. And these colleges were founded for white people, not indigenous people, not enslaved people, right? To create a curriculum that would educate those people for the world that was trying to be built, right? And I just think it's good to like put all of that on the table because that's exactly what we're talking about tonight. The fact that universities and colleges are a political project. The question of who gets to be here, what you learn while you're here, what they think they're training you to do, those are like deeply political questions. And sometimes we're just riding it. We're just like, oh God, I gotta go to college, I gotta like get a job, maybe I'm gonna try to like have something that my family hasn't gotten to have, or I'm gonna try to keep having my family, whatever the story is for you, right? But that is always a design, right? This space is a design, and it's constantly being redesigned, and it's constantly being, the design of it and what its purposes are and who it's for are something that people are engaging with feminist resistance since the beginning, right? So the processes that led this university to admit Black women were political processes that were about what women are, what women's education is, right? All the processes along the way that have been and continue to be controversial are part of what we're here to talk about tonight. I wanted to kind of put that into a broader perspective. And because universities are political projects in like a bunch of ways, right? Like they also are projects, the universities are places where like terrible foreign policy is designed and like military equipment is designed and student activists for eons have challenged that, right? There are places where really bad economic policy is developed and where other ideas, resistance ideas are developed. In every way, these are spaces that are hot and juicy and intense and full of conflict and full of a lot of space for feminist inquiry and feminist resistance. And that's where we are. So even when the contemporary neoliberal university tells us that it's a depoliticized space in which you all just need to learn how to like work together as a diverse community to become corporate leaders. But that's not what it's ever been about to be college age. And it's not what it should be about. And so I want to kind of talk about that together. And of course, there's been activism and resistance at universities in the United States, as long as universities have existed, around things like, and that these controversies are still going on, like admissions, like why do they use racist tests like the SAT to decide who gets to come to the university? Like that's still an ongoing debate and complexity. It's debate within law schools about the LSAT, about the curriculum, why are certain classes offered or not offered, right? There's been huge movements in the history of the US to get ethnic studies and women's studies to be things that exist on campuses. Probably some of you, know some of those histories, maybe you've gotten to study them. One of the most famous places of that history is City College just up the road, right? Where major protests happened that produced by people who were expelled and excluded from the framework of higher education, particularly people of color in New York City, saying, no, this is our college and this should be about educating our communities, and our communities should also be who the faculty are, and also should be in the curriculum, right? There's like really intense histories happening right here in the sets of blocks that we're here in right now. And of course, there's lots of history and contemporary realities about people fighting about how universities, as huge holders of land and wealth, invest our money, right? So there's long history of divestment campaigns about South Africa, right? During apartheid, there was a huge campaign going on worldwide to try to get big holders of money to divest from South Africa, right? So that to try to put pressure on South Africa to end apartheid. And today, the same kinds of pressure are being put on the state of Israel, right, to resist apartheid in Israel through a divestment campaign. And college students like you guys all over the country are working on divestment campaigns to get their universities to divest from companies that benefit from the occupation and from apartheid in Israel, right? So this is like a political space. That's what I wanted to start with. This is a political space. And Barnard has to choose all the time who it serves, right? Who it's about. Has Barnard chosen that it's primarily about serving the Lenape people? It has not, right? Has it chosen to primarily be about serving people of color, about immigrants, about right? Who it chooses to serve is a really big deal, and that's also always being contested and debated. Is it about New York City or is it national? All those kinds of questions, and they're all political questions, and they're all questions that people who are here now and people who have come here before, like me, have a huge stake in and a responsibility to. They're questions we can't ignore. If we're the ones who got to be here, it's on us, right? We've got some kind of obligation about it, which is a pretty interesting role to have. So I was thinking about coming here, I was thinking like, what do I think about women's education? Like, this is a really interesting question. Like, why do we have Barnard? Why did I come here? I mostly came here because financially it was really good. Totally real good. But, and it was a great place to learn a lot of great things. I really was excited to do that learning in New York City. There was a lot of wonderful things about it for me. But when I think about why, some of you were saying to me, let's just get rid of women's education, let's get rid of places like Barnard. I would actually have some pushback on that, right? Like, I think there's some really significant reasons why we still see gender oppression as a central problem in higher ed. Like, no doubt, right? Like, there's still intense marginalization of women from many disciplines, especially science and math and economics and other ones that are traditionally really held in, by men. There's a broad scale problem of, classroom marginalization of women in K through 12 and into higher ed. We still see that women are underrepresented in a lot of aspects of academia. Women are paid less in academia, especially women of color are less likely to have tenure track for positions in academia. We see all this marginalization, and more broadly that, like, secretary is still the #1 job for women. The lowest paid roles inside any industry are still more likely to be for women, especially women of color, and the higher paid roles are more likely to be for men, especially white men, right? Like, that's still the deal. There's still the pay gap. That stuff is still with us, and so that makes sense that we would still want to produce spaces of higher ed where we could pay specific attention to those problems and perhaps try to send resources in directions that are where they're not generally sent. Not to mention that colleges and universities are still intense spaces of sexual assault, right? Everywhere, I go speak colleges a lot, everywhere that is a central issue. Sexual violence against women is endemic in our society, and universities and colleges are a really intense place where that happens. So that's another reason we might think that women's education has a particular role, or that we might want to have a higher ed community in which we're specifically talking about gender oppression, and that might be preparing people who are there with a certain set of skills that are actually hard to get because of the kinds of oppression people face in higher ed. So women's education isn't the only way to do that, right? It's only one strategy, but I think it's one that actually still has a really meaningful place. And I feel like it's important to say because, of course, that's up for debate. Like, some people think that that's not the case, right? But the problem right now with women's education in the U.S., or one problem I'm here to talk about, is that it doesn't admit trans women, right? Like, it is transphobic, right? Like, that's really deep, right? The fundamental message of transphobia is that trans people are not who we say we are, that we're who the government says we are, or who a doctor says we are, or we're who any random person who wants to beat us up on the street says we are. Like, that's the message of transphobia is, we don't believe you, you don't exist, you're not who you say we are. Right now, women's colleges in the United States are saying that to trans people. And that matters, that's on blast. It really matters when a big institution that is using a definition of woman that is fundamentally transphobic. And it's like a set of institutions that are tied together doing this practice right now. And that is an urgent problem, regardless of whether or not you think Barnard's like the coolest strategy in the world for feminism, or it's disappointing to you, or whatever. This is a big problem for all of us. And if we're connected to this institution, we have an obligation to remedy it, I think. So, one of the things that I just want to mention, so I've been to a lot of women's colleges recently, talking to a lot of students, faculty, and staff, and administrators about this dilemma. And one of the things that some of these colleges are saying, although I don't think Barnard is saying this explicitly, but I've heard different things. Part of what they do is, part of what all these schools are doing right now is keeping their policies a little bit hard to understand, which is because I think they're unsure what to do, and there's a lot of complexity and politics to it. But one of the things that some of these schools are saying right now, and I worry some schools are moving towards, is we'll let people in if their documents say F. And I really wanted to directly address this because I think there's like a bunch of like severe misunderstandings underlying this framework that it could be useful if we're all conversant in, right? Like we all want to be able to like ready the talking points on this one, since I assume you're all going to go out and be advocates for Barnard to become more aligned with our feminist beliefs about gender oppression in higher ed, right? So there's a couple things that are wrong with this. If you have the idea like, yeah, sure, anybody who applies, who's got F on their documents can come to Barnard, we've got a couple of major problems. One is that every identity document issuing agency in the United States has its own rule about whether you can change your gender on it, and if so, how. So if when you were born, they put something like, say, M on your birth certificate, from there, and you have numerous other documents that are produced that have that letter on it, or that have that in the records, like your Social Security Administration documentation and your driver's license, and maybe a passport if you have one. All the different documents a person might have, benefits card if you get public benefits, all the different things you might have. Each of those agencies in each jurisdiction has its own rules about whether you can change your gender and if so, right? So one thing is that two people who are in the same situation won't have the same experience. If one person is born in Tennessee, you can't ever change your gender on your birth certificate in Tennessee. Another person is born in New York State, there's a certain rule upstate, there's a different rule in the city. I mean, right, so that's a problem because there's no there. There's no such thing as a legal gender. This is like a kind of common mistake a lot of people don't understand. In reality, there's a huge administrative matrix of different rules. The other thing about it is that people who are college age are very unlikely to have, even if they happen to live in all jurisdictions and have all pieces of ideas that potentially could change, to have been able to change that. Because many jurisdictions in some way or another require you to produce a lot of evidence of healthcare to change some of these pieces of ID. Again, they're all different. But most people who are college age have not had access to that kind of healthcare, and especially not if they're low income, more likely if they're people of color, people with disabilities. These people are all more intensely denied access to healthcare. And also, if you're under 18, it's very hard to get most healthcare without your parental consent. The majority of trans people do not have support from their families about their trans identities, especially. So there's numerous ways in which having any rule that ties who Barnard sees as an applicant to any kind of government document is going to be super, more exclusive for people of color, low-income people, younger applicants, like people who are typical college-age applicants, and people with disabilities. So those are all reasons why this is a bad idea, in addition to the fact that we're feminists. We don't believe the government tells you what gender is, right? Our whole thing is fighting bad ideas the government has about what gender is, right? That's been our project forever, right? So the idea of saying, well, just let the people over at Social Security or over at the DMV of Virginia decide whether or not you get to come to Barnard. That's not a principled approach to the project of education that's against gender oppression, right? So I just want to even though that's kind of detailed and technical, I just wanted to put that in there because I think a lot of students are offered that back by administrators when in conversations about how we're going to figure out who gets to come to Barnard, specifically when it comes to are we going to allow trans women to come to Barnard. So the real question is, why should trans people be at Barnard, right? That's probably one of the pieces that's in here for all of you. I mean, in my opinion, broadly, right, because trans women are women, right? Because people are who they say they are. That's a really big, fundamental, anti-transphobic feminist belief I have that I hope you share. But also because trans people are gender oppressed people. And this is what the mission, I think, of places like Barnard is about, right? Trans people are intensely marginalized in education and employment, are intensely poor because of this, and highly criminalized, right? If what I hope Barnard is about is lifting people into education who have that door slammed in their face because of harmful norms about gender, this is a group of people we really want to be making a pathway here for. In the same way that I also think Barnard should really prioritize Indigenous people, people with disabilities, people of color, immigrant people, all the people who specifically are going to experience gender oppression in higher ed in a sharpened, heightened way, right? Just to share some stats about the kinds of broader context of trans people. A few years ago, kind of the biggest study that's ever happened of trans people and discrimination and happened in the US, and they found some really wild things, like 78% of people in the survey had been harassed in K through 12, and 35% had been assaulted, physically assaulted. 35% of trans people have been physically assaulted during their K through 12 experience. That's so shocking to me. 15% dropped out because of that harassment. I think a broader set also drops out because of other forms of school push out related to racism, ableism, etc. 90% of trans people have experienced some kind of discrimination in their job or have had to hide in order to prevent it, right? That's a huge number. Trans people in general have double the unemployment rate of the general population, and trans people of color have 4 times the unemployment rate of the general population. 26% of trans people have lost a job because of their gender, and a fifth of trans people have been homeless in their lives. So like if we're just talking about like trying to make sure that people who are experiencing gender oppression get access to higher ed and all the things that can come with higher ed, right? This is a population that Barnard really wants to be serving, not intensely stopping from attending, which is the current situation. So the other piece of this is that, you know, this isn't the first time that feminism has had a problem with excluding some women, right? You all hopefully are studying all of this, right? So there's a long history of a feminist mistake that we commonly have seen made where it's like, no, we're for these women and not these women, right? Or we're going to define women in a way that actually makes it impossible for certain people's experiences and lives to be seen or heard or understood or spoken to. Or we're going to declare that there's a universal experience of womanhood and all the other women, too bad, right? Because this is what being a woman is. I mean, that is just the story of all the consistent feminist exclusions of indigenous women, women with disabilities, of queer women. I mean, this is the deal, right? So this is another one of those moments. It's pretty scripted. We've been through it. We kind of know what to do, which is to stop. Not rocket science, I think, right? But it is a consistent tendency, right? And it is a problem to some degree of the framework of women's education is that that becomes like a rigid category that then people seek to define. And then also people inherit definitions, for example, they try to inherit them from the government or from some other like really conservative space that shouldn't be what defines the project of women's education or the project of educating gender oppressed people. To me, the real purpose of this space and of what women's colleges are now is to address gender oppression in education, and it's an aspirational purpose, right? It's a purpose of trying to serve people who are underserved in higher education, to provide access to a set of tools and experiences that people are blocked from, and it's not a purpose we'll ever end. We'll consistently be, I mean, trans people are not the only people excluded from this space, right? Like, that is not, right, trans women are not the only people who are not getting access to Barnard. Barnard is an elite private education. There's a lot of different ways in which people are kept out, right? This is one of those vectors, right? But what we want to be doing is having that aspirational project of saying, how can Barnard be looking always to figure out how to be a space that provides access to education to people who gender oppression and all of its complicated interactions with racism, colonialism, ableism, capitalism, et cetera, produce, you know, populations that do not have access to higher ed that want it, or produce a space inside Barnard that's hostile to certain students, or that you know, denies certain kinds of knowledge and education and produces other forms of parts of the curriculum as enhanced, right? So that is this transformative vision that we could have for Barnard, right? That I think that people have at different levels in the alumni population, in the faculty, staff, and student populations. At the very least, Barnard should enforce a transphobia policy. Even if we can't all agree with aspiration, we just, at the very least, it's vitally important that we not have major institutions that we are part of be articulating a politics that is absolutely deadly to certain populations. The logic that says trans people are not who we say we are, that says trans women are not women, that says it's okay to tell people what gender they should be, is the same logic that produces all the stats I read earlier about trans people's marginalization and literally produces early death for trans people. So we don't want this institution to have a message that aligns with something deadly for a very vulnerable population. That's gotta go. Even if we can't all agree to the aspirational vision of having Barnard really reach the most underserved populations, which I think and hope we would. So it's key that we end that policy, and I think something else people are talking about too is not only end that policy, but also produce a campus climate in which people are having enough of these conversations that the trans women who come here don't experience like enormous violence and discrimination and harassment from fellow students, faculty, and staff. Those are like key steps we need to do. Obviously that's a lot of deep work to do that changing of the environment, and it's related to work that I'm sure already is going on and also needs to go on around addressing racism, ableism, classism, et cetera, are also all here and present. I know they were present when I was a Barnard student. They're present at every institution that I visit and every institution I've worked at. And so doing that ongoing anti-oppression work is key. But also we can't say, oh yeah, we'll change the policy after we fix that. That's another like, that's the administration trying to like, you know, like, so don't fall into that idea. We're not ready. You know, you get ready. Because I think that the final thing I want to say is just a few things about the role of student leadership on this and the role of student activism. We do live in a period right now where there's been an intense depoliticization of campuses. That is intentional. because there is such a radical history of student activism in the United States that has really stirred things up and fucked things up for the man. So it's no joke that they don't want you to be active, and that there's a lot of things that have been produced inside colleges and universities to try to neutralize student activism, and there's a lot of brilliant people who are always fighting that back. But one thing I'd recommend is studying the history of student activism in this region and at Barnard and Columbia, because people have protested a lot of important things here and won a lot of important things here. Students here have done a lot of work in solidarity with laborers on this campus. People have done a lot of work in solidarity with, against all kinds of injustice in the city, internationally. I mean, there's like really essential, deep histories of that activism here, and the more we understand and learn about those histories, which really are hidden from us, right? And it's very convenient because we're all constantly leaving, so it's really hard to have institutional memory. There's a lot there, right? And sometimes student orgs are good at passing that along, and sometimes it's easy for it to get lost because of the ways we do leadership, et cetera. But figuring that out and talking to alumni about previous experiences of disruption and of winning stuff and of losing stuff, and also figuring out just amongst each other, like what activist skills do people already on this campus have? What have people already figured out about how this campus works? What are people already figuring out about what they want to see changed while they're here, and how to stay plugged in when they leave? Like, that's actually within your reach. And one of the things that I think is like the biggest message these days that stops this is that you all have too much work to do, so you can't do activism here. That's a trap. You know what I mean? This is your work, right? Like this institution is a part of your responsibility, right? And we're told to only look inward and only be responsible to a narrow career track. Like this is about making deep connections and taking responsibility for the city we live in, the institutions we're part of, the harm they're doing, especially if we're those who get to be here, right? We have a really big responsibility to ask why that is so, because it's hard people who aren't in these chairs because they didn't get to come in here and make the noise that needs to be made on this issue. So I think we're gonna do like a short Q&A before we do the small group work. But do you guys have questions, thoughts, or clarifications?
How would you respond to the argument that's been made about the risk of Barnard losing their legal Title IX status if they were to admit to?
I think that they should fight. You know what I mean? I think that there's a lot of fears around it. I think the question was how do I respond to the argument that Barnard could lose its Title IX status or have like legal issues related to this? I guess I think that Barnard should fight those fights. I think that also, I wonder if they're overstated. I'm curious about it. I don't think that there's any way, in my view, if Barnard admits women who previously had not been admitted, like admits trans women, they're admitting women. As I mentioned, there's no single legal standard about what a woman is. So if Barnard uses an assessment and determines this person eligible for admission, I think they could really fight on that question of what makes that person eligible or ineligible. I think there's a lot of ways Barnard could support the students who come to make sure that they have what they need to show what they need to show. I mean, I think there's workarounds. There always is. There's always a lot of reasons, and often legal reasons, why change can't happen. They're usually something you can fight. That's my view. I think that when you invite a speaker to share their thoughts, that's what they do. I think the question of power is interesting because I actually am standing in an institution that has like a giant policy that's opposed to what I'm saying. And so I'm bringing actually a resistant voice to the thing that is the institutional view. But you totally don't have to agree with it. But you all invited me to share my views, and that's what I'm doing. I didn't do anything about this when I was at Barnard. I went here for about 2 years. I don't know if my experience here is that useful. A lot of my focus was on activism, and that was not on campus. Although I was part of social networks here that were important to me, and I also learned a lot from feminist professors here that was really meaningful to my development. But most of my activism at the time was a lot of activism against Mayor Giuliani and some really horrible things he was doing all over the city. And so it was a particular moment of politicization off campus for me. But I think that, and I wasn't aware of this issue when I went here. It wasn't something I was talking about, and I think for me it's been a learning process And I think it's really interesting. I think right now this is up at women's colleges in a different way, in part because of where the trans movement is compared to where it was in the 90s when I was here. I think that's exciting to see that change. But it wasn't a conversation that I saw people having on campus, which is typical of an exclusive environment, right? That there's lots of room for silence around who's not allowed in. Yeah. Yeah.
So I've been kind of talking about this and trying. I don't want to say activism because even though like there's a misconception that if you claim activism and you claim being an activist that you have some semblance of success. And I've only recently begun to have some success. And so I've heard since my first year two kind of responses to the idea of admitting trans women to campus, to Barnard, and generally women's colleges. First, yeah, totally we should admit trans women, but we shouldn't admit trans men. And trans men as a category loosely like extended to include masculine, non-gender, maybe identifying folks that are already admitted to this campus, such as myself. And hearing that was rough for me, obviously. And then also, like, no, we shouldn't, but we should be more of a space to work within having trans men and women on this campus. And I was just wondering, since this wasn't something that you were organizing around when you were at Barnard, if you could maybe like speak to better ways to respond to both of those arguments rather than like immediately getting defensive or I've gotten a little bit better, but I still struggle with ways to address both of those arguments, and then how to respond when I've been also informed that, for example, Mills admits trans women despite legal recognition on paperwork, and like why isn't Barnard doing that now? You know, as if I'm the administrator. So if you could respond. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the way that I think about the question of like transmasculine people and trans men and gender nonconforming people who are already admitted, I mean, first of all, I'm so sorry if someone told you you shouldn't be here. That's like a shitty, not okay thing. That sucks. To me, the question is about gender oppression and people who are marginalized by various forms of gender violence and discrimination related to higher ed and generally. Trans people in general and gender nonconforming people fit here. You know, because those issues are brought, right now, I mean, basically right now Barnard is saying, you are not who you say you are your birth gender, by letting trans men and gender nonconforming people be here, and right, like, that's just a really transphobic stance, so it's kind of a fluke, you know, in a weird way, because it's, right, but to me, a principled stance is to say, we're creating a space that is about addressing gender oppression in higher ed, and that would include people who've gone through K through 12 as girls, as gender nonconforming people, as trans people, right? Like who've got, you know, who've had this range of experiences that come from living in a culture that says this is what it is to be a man, this is what it is to be a woman, this is what your brain is going to be like, this is what you're allowed to study, this is what you're allowed to become. Those experiences are what I think Barnard is trying to be about addressing. And so to me, that's how I usually answer that, is to ask people to think about the context of gender oppression. Right, and so that even someone who, let's say, like has a trans man identity has the weight of transphobia and patriarchy throughout his life, you know, leading to the moment of going to college, and can benefit from a space that has a feminist and anti-transphobic analysis for being in school. What was the second part? It was
Mills College admitting. Okay, this was also really awkward because I was informed of this in an interview about trans people at women's colleges, and like the interviewer just threw this in my face, like, so Mills College, because I was talking about how the paperwork argument and why I think that it's not right, and she was like, okay, awesome, but what do you say in response to Mills College admitting trans women or people, like gender marginalized folks, despite what's written on their paperwork? Like, why isn't Barnard at that level? And I am not an administrator, and I said something very kind of ambiguous, like very ambiguous, but basically like the argument that people, at least people when I go home and I mention anything about trans stuff, because I like don't have anything to be out of, because I don't know. So I just made the like I've heard people say that's a way to sneak into Columbia. And Mills doesn't have that partnership. So Barnard's also special in that we have the relationship to Columbia that other women's colleges don't have. So how would you also respond to that?
I mean,
question?
Yeah, I guess I would say, yeah, I think that if Mills is doing that, if Mills is allowing trans women in and not having the government tell them what a woman is, that's great and good. It's great there's a model out there, and it only further proves that all the rest of women's colleges that aren't doing that can do it and other accessible. So I think it's okay that your position is antagonistic towards the administration on this topic, on this policy, and that you support alternative models. And none of us have to defend Barnard on this. We can be advocates for the alternative. I mean, the whole question of like sneaking into Columbia and all that, I mean, it's just like, I don't know. I don't know what to say. Like, you know, yes, it's horrible that the entire world of higher ed is incredibly hierarchical and like super sexist and racist. And I don't know. I mean, you know, people should go to school however they need to. God bless them. I don't know. I think that, you know, the implication that anybody is going to use trans access to school to sneak into school, that's transphobic stereotype about how trans people are sneaky frauds. Like that's right. So that was like nip that in the bud. The idea that anything that people will come to Barnard who are, you know, disingenuously, all of that. That's not a reason to keep trans people out, right? Like even if somebody comes to Barnard disingenuously in any number of ways, that is not a reason for a policy that keeps out all the trans people who want to come here. So I think that if that's useful, I think that a typical red herring on any issue related to transphobia, like on whether or not trans people can access bathrooms, on whether or not trans people can access shelters, is what if somebody sneaks in pretending they're trans? I mean, this literally is used around like airport security. I mean, it's used in every way. And the reality is, even if somebody out there has bad motivations, all trans people should be punished because of that, right? And not allowed to go to school wherever they do. So I think that's a kind of a key thing to know.